introductions. So, as the title was sort of read out, the GCC regions versus other regions, what can we learn? What can we do? I guess one of the places that we should probably start thinking of is regulation. Is that a good place to start?
Yeah, we should, but I first need a moment to take this in, because I know it's going to be one of the last times that we'll be on stage speaking in a session like this. And a year from now, 2 years from now, there'll be a chat GPT interrogating another chat GPT with a third one in the audience who is tweeting out the summary to all the attendees who will not be in this room.
Well, let's hope
we should savor it. Look, when we talk about comparing regions, the first point I want to make is we talk here about MENA. I'll get to GCC very quickly. I think MENA is already, frankly, a complete misconstruct. It takes longer to fly from Dubai to Morocco than it takes to fly from Dubai to Sweden. The place is really far away. Yes, people write the same language, and that's about it. There is very little that combines that side of the continent with this side of the continent. So MENA is a bit of a misnomer, and certainly from my point of view, irrelevant to our industry to talk about a MENA FinTech concept. Now within GCC, imagine that you had a country with 51 million inhabitants, and you split that country into 6 distinct regulatory regimes with their own licensing requirements, their own on-soil data governance standards, such that in one part of the country you really couldn't serve another part of the country. And when we talk about a country of 51 million people, we talk about a country that is smaller than the UK, smaller than Germany, much smaller than obviously the US, India, China, Indonesia, Brazil. So we talk about a relatively small country, and I know the GCC is not a country, that's the point I'm making. We turned a region of 51 million people with a GDP that is comparable to the UK and France into 6 very, very distinctive regions that, other than language and loose political collaboration, don't really share very much. And what's the impact of that on fintechs? And certainly one thing that I believe should be top of the agenda for the sector is that if I set up in Saudi Arabia or pick any other country, it doesn't really help me serve any of these other economies. I need to go to the same expensive process of local data centers, local teams, local license applications, local product approvals with regulators in each of those countries who operate differently. So I think for a fintech in this region, that is the #1 challenge. You can be in one of those countries and have virtually no relevance to the other 5 without major additional work. And it's not just the regulatory part, which adds a lot of cost, by the way. It also means that your target market is limited unless you are going through the efforts of setting up shop in the other markets.
So if we were to look at another region, and maybe let's look at the US, because obviously the US is not also necessarily a completely homogenous one single country. You have federal law, you have state law. Obviously there's some differences, I would imagine, but is there anything that we can learn from that? Is that purely due to the size of each individual state, or?
Well, look, I mean, the US is one sovereign country, and that's already makes a huge difference, of course. Maybe the European Union is one way of looking at it, where you broadly, there's lots of complexity here. It's not as simple as setting up in one country and you can operate everywhere, but it kind of boils down like that. And I'm not living in a dream world. I'm not thinking that tomorrow the governments of the 6 GCC countries will say, oh yeah, let's have one regulatory regime and one regulator. What I would encourage, though, is that 2 things happen. One, the industry, which is us, are speaking in one voice to our local regulators about the importance of doing this without too much deference. There's a lot of deference to regulators in this region, and I believe one can have a full, free and frank conversation about the opportunities that are opened up. The second aspect is that I believe the regulators ought to have a more organized agenda between them to look for as much commonality and passporting opportunities while maintaining the sovereignty of each individual country. That would be a big, I think, a big step forward for the industry. It's not the only thing that needs to be done, by the way, and not the only thing we can learn. Because if you think about FinTech or any other tech, what things are important? Any access to customers. We just talked about it. How do you create a market of 51 million customers instead of 6 individual markets? Access to talent. The region is doing a great job there. Every country is taking initiatives to make it easier for talent to show up and help contribute to building the local ecosystem. And frankly, no GCC country does it better than the UAE with the 100,000 golden visas. And in general, you just need to look around here to see how much of a global melting pot the country is and how it is welcoming talent from abroad. The third ingredient is capital. And capital in 2 ways. We all understand we need investors. The VC scene in this part of the world is frankly in its infancy. If you compare our total funds available relative to any other fintech hub, it's growing fast, and it's made huge headway, and at the same time it is comparatively very thin, very small. Now there's one thing that's going on in the world that's helping a lot. I don't need to explain to anyone we have a financial crisis on our hands. What that means is that by and large the venture capital and private equity firms in Europe and the US find it really difficult to get their LPs to commit to the drawdowns. And the details don't matter. LPs have all sorts of rules that where they are forced to maintain certain percentages of asset allocation, and with public markets coming down, it means that the ratios are out of whack and they need to curtail their commitment to VC and PE. And as a result, as you will have read in the newspaper, every VC worth their salt is now knocking at the doors of the sovereign wealth funds in the region. Can you please become our LP? And money that a few years ago they would say, no, we don't really want their money. Today they are, well, quote unquote, begging for the money. That comes with an opportunity for local companies to become a logo on the websites of those investors. Because that's what they need to demonstrate. Yeah? The governments want to see that those investors are making contributions to building the local ecosystem. So for the first time, perhaps, our local fintech and venture market more broadly is opening up to global investors, which is really important. That's only half the equation with regard to money, because investors, the word says it, they invest to get out. They need to make money as well. How do you make money? You either sell the company in a trade deal or you IPO. And we all understand that our local IPO markets and our stock exchanges are relatively thin. The total market cap of the regional GCC stock exchanges is approximately 1.1 trillion. And if you take out Aramco, it's about 400 billion. Now, that is 20 times less, 40 times less almost than NASDAQ by itself. It is significantly less than Paris, than London, you name them. So we can't wait, in effect, for local stock markets to open up with the same depth of liquidity that other fintech hubs have. So what's the implication? For many of us, I'd like to think the company that I'm leading is an exception. We do think that we can IPO in the local market, but many companies will need to look for IPOs abroad or do a trade sale. And that in turn means that you need to build your company in a different way. So it is, as you can hear, I'm not part of the crowd that says everything is hunky-dory and unbelievable potential and the sky is the limit. No, there's a couple of things that need to change, regulation and capital in particular.
I guess the thing is, it's easy to say we need to be all joined up and have one regulation across all of the GCC countries. How can that actually be achieved, though, do you think?
Well, I'm in the fortunate position that I only need to worry about how to lead JIDIA day to day. And as anyone who works with me will attest, the last thing that I should be is a politician. I'm not cut out for it, and I wouldn't know. I wouldn't want to venture either. I do not quite know how that would work. All I can do as a representative of the industry is lend my voice to saying, look, unless you do that, you will hamper innovation in the region, in the sectors. You will keep your markets artificial small, and maybe you are happy with that, but then make it a conscious choice.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, you know, what's the negative side of things if that isn't able to be accomplished? It's going to limit the growth of each individual country.
Yeah, I think there's a pro and a con to that. Let's start with the pro, because our local regulatory fragmentation, the fact that it's not that easy to do business in this part of the world, also explains why there are so few global fintechs that are setting up shop in the region.
One might argue if you're a global fintech, it's actually a protection mechanism, because if you are able to negotiate that regulatory hurdle, you then are very well protected from anybody competing with you.
Well, to an extent, I think it is more a matter that the global I mean, I used to spend a lot of my time, of course, with these global fintechs, and they would look at these markets and say, well, relative to the potential, it's a lot of work, and some things are really difficult for us, like the idea that if I have a global cloud-based platform, that I need to set up an on-prem hosted solution in 6 different countries, I think I'd rather just put some more money in Europe. I'm putting it facetiously, but that is the thought process. It is, so the pro for us is that to an extent we keep the global competitor out. The con is that your own market is relatively, you're constraining yourself. It is really hard to build a world-class company if you don't have access to millions of consumers, if you do not, if you cannot base fully cloud-native solutions, which is really the norm nowadays. So there is a cost to it. And this will not happen overnight. I recognize this will take time. And again, I'm not so naive to think that we will have one regulatory regime. I would encourage the industry to speak in one voice and the regulators to engage in a debate on responsible homogenization in those areas where it will have the biggest impact on the cultivation of not just fintech, but frankly any tech sector.
Yeah, and I think moving on to one of your other points, which was on the investment side of things, obviously similarly with that, it's quite obvious that VCs get involved in the companies because they are looking for returns, but also potentially exits. And you could argue that exits are actually more important to VCs than just returns. And so without having that output of a successful local sort of stock exchange, that's also going to limit the larger companies, do you believe?
Well, it's stock exchange and it's trade exit. So all in all, is it MENA or, I made a note of that because so many numbers. Yeah, MENA, so that's a big area. Only 57 fintech exits in 2022. And that includes any exit, any very successful companies and half bankrupt companies who did a fire sale. 57. And it is disproportionately skewed to the, you would expect that, the UAE, Egypt and Saudi, who between them account for 45 out of those 57 exits of what is a really large region when you speak about MENA. So the exit is thin. And when you think about how do you exit? And JDI, the company that I run, is also majority private equity owned. So obviously we think about exit a lot. And we'd like to think that we, for all sorts of reasons, have a shot at IPOing in the Saudi market. But we're also a rarity of being a profitable fintech and being at a scale that, etc. It doesn't matter. It's not for every fintech out there. So what do you do? If there's no depth in the local market, if there are no institutional investors who are used to buying, call it Nasdaq, quote unquote, Nasdaq-like stock, then you look at trade exits, and you will run into the same issue that I talked about when I spoke about why are so few global companies setting up. When you want to sell your regional company to a global platform, and it just looks so different in its setup, and it looks highly fragmented and relatively high cost, the force needs to be with you a little bit. And right now, of course, we live in times where fintech valuations have been slashed around the world. It will be quite difficult to do an attractive deal. So then the implication is, can you build out of this region a FinTech that has relevance beyond the region. Now, that's not so crazy. Look at not so far from here, Tel Aviv is of course quite an innovation hub. Very few companies are built for the Israeli market only. They are all looking at a global market, and that's a mindset that we don't quite have here yet. Now, to do that, it's mindset, it's technology. It's really hard to build a global company if you start with an on-premise hosted solution. You know, nothing will be cloud native, so that doesn't help. And it's capital. Building global is a lot of money, and for that you need deep VC. So there's a bit of a vicious cycle at this moment that will be turned into a virtuous cycle, where I personally believe the biggest catalyst is what I talked about a few minutes ago. Global investors knocking at the doors of the sovereign wealth funds here to become an LP. That will be a big catalyst to have access to that capital that is required. Because the talent is there, the ideas are there, the government support is there. They're just these, you know, few small issues that need to be ironed out to make the region come to its natural.
It's an interesting point that you sort of touched on there about the sort of the idea of building companies for a global market, which I think it's fair to say that most of the GCC currently looks very much at domestic market. And one of the differences perhaps between the region and other regions, most of the other regions such as the UK, Europe and most of the European cities have an export opportunity where the government is actually helping companies to build on that global stage. Do you think that's something that is needed now, or do you think that's something will come in the future?
Look, the sooner the better. There's no downside to having it now. But there might be another explanation for that, which is if you look at the financial sector participants in the region, they tend to be very local. There are very few global financial powerhouses that are domesticated in the GCC countries. The banks tend to be local, the insurance companies are local, the asset managers are local. The exceptions are the sovereign wealth funds, who are incredibly global, of course, in their outlook and in their investment portfolio. But when your incumbent financial sector is highly local, it also becomes difficult, depending on what kind of fintech you are, but certainly if you're in the B2B space, to, on the back of that, build a global relevance. And so there are, that is something that you need to do with intent from day one onwards.
Yeah, as you say, because changing it at the end of the process is actually much more difficult than embedding it
you're
from
stuck.
the beginning.
You've made all your design decisions, you've made all your configurations, etc. That it is really quite hard and costly to pivot.
And I guess that also is, again, it's a positive and negative, because you could argue that localization is protecting other global companies from coming in, because they would have to localize their own product for that region as well.
Absolutely. So it's a double-edged sword. But we shouldn't forget, in the end, the aspiration of the region, and of course we all see the very significant changes in Saudi Arabia in particular, but not exclusively. The UAE has been very open to the rest of the world, very much a participant, and the aspirations of the region are to be a formidable player on the global stage and leading with innovation, leading with building up new sectors that are away from the oil and gas sector only. So as part of that vision, I think opening up and creating a regulatory and political framework that allows a sector like FinTech to flourish on the global stage is really important.
Okay. And assuming that next year or the year after, when we do come back and sit on this stage, it's not a chatbot talking to each other, what would you have seen, what would you have liked to have seen changed within a year or so?
Well, I think in all fairness, the only realistic aspiration I believe that one can have, and it's still an aspiration, is that in a year from now there is a dialogue in the fintech industry that speaks in one voice regarding the importance of this, with conviction and with appropriate deference, but not too much. So it's clear and firm, and that there is a sign that regulators in the region, and they might be doing it behind closed doors, of course, but that they are more outwardly speaking about what can we do to facilitate the interoperability, so to speak, between fintech companies in our different countries? How do we open up each other's markets for each other? Let's start with that.
Well, that sounds like a perfect place to end our conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on stage today.
Thank you very much.